Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 65 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. I would make an awful spy. I just spent way too long trying to figure out how to introduce this episode in code, but I failed. I just couldn't find a good way to do it. The reason I wanted to introduce this episode in code is because today we're going to talk about spycraft during the American War for Independence. This is a listener-requested episode. You requested both the topic and our guest historian, Alexander Rose, author of Washington Spies, the story of America's first spy ring. Now, if that title doesn't ring a bell, perhaps this one might. AMC adapted Alex's book for its television drama, Turn, Washington Spies. During our conversation, Alex reveals information about the origins and participants of the Culper Spy Ring, how the Culper Ring worked, and how his book, Washington Spies, became the basis for AMC's television drama, Turn. And yes, this means we will discuss one of your most frequently asked questions: what aspects of Turn have been embellished for television? I know you are really excited about this episode. I am too. But before we get to it, just a quick reminder that Ben Franklin's World has a crowdfunding campaign. If you love this show and would like to help support it, please text SupportBFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement to find out how you can support the show in both financial and non-financial ways. Thank you for your consideration, and now, without further ado, let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest earned his doctorate from Cambridge University. He has lived in the United States, Australia, England, and Canada. He studied and worked as an historian before becoming a journalist, and today he works as a historian, producer, and writer for AMC's television drama, Turn, which is based on one of his 4 books, Washington Spies, the story of America's first spy ring. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Alexander Rose.
Well, thanks for having me on. Hi.
Alex, I find it curious that you've managed to live in almost every nation in the British Commonwealth. So which one was your favorite?
I was born in the U.S. I was born in New York, and then I went to Australia. I went to school there for a long time, and then I went to England for a long time to be at university, and I worked there. And then I went over to Canada and worked there for a couple of years for a newspaper. It's difficult to be diplomatic, it's difficult to know, or difficult to say which one I like the most. Though I don't think the U.S. is, at least anymore, not part of the British Commonwealth. But I think, I'm very fond of the U.S. That's why I came back here. But I know England pretty well, though I haven't been there in quite a while.
Is your favoritism for the U.S. how you became interested in spycraft during the American War for Independence?
No, absolutely not, actually. That was just a coincidence. I was down in Washington, D.C. I was reading a biography of Kim Philby, who some of your listeners may know of as the famous British traitor spy of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I think at the same time I was reading about Benedict Arnold. I was sort of casting around for ideas, and I was interested in Arnold. And for some reason, I just sort of put 2 and 2 together, and I thought, Arnold was, I guess you could say, a bit of a defector. I mean, he was lured over, in a way, over to the British side, which is quite a coup if you think about it. And then I began thinking, what was he the only one? I mean, was he the only spy during the war? Because I'd never really heard of any. And so I began looking into it. I went to Georgetown University Library, and I started looking through the card catalogs because they had those things in those days. And I was looking under all these keywords like, espionage, American Revolution, George Washington, intelligence, that kind of thing. And virtually nothing was coming up. It was very strange. I kept on looking more and more insistently because I thought there must be something obvious that I'm missing here. And it turns out that so little had been written on this. It was just kind of this almost dead field that I began thinking about, well, maybe, talk about Arnold in the context of espionage during the Revolution and George Washington and so on. And after that, I began thinking, well, I've got to focus the book a little bit on a couple of spies. And Arnold had been kind of done to death already. So that's when after a bit of reading around, I found a book by Morton Pennypacker written in the mid-30s, which is sort of a very good book for its time and type. And I discovered the Culper Ring, of whom I'd never heard, of course. And then I started putting the proposal together, and I sent it off to my agent. And then pretty soon afterwards, I left newspaper journalism anyway and started writing the book full time. And that's basically how it happened.
Benedict Arnold has that effect on people because most Americans know him as a traitor. But in reality, before he was a traitor, he was a hero.
Oh, yes, he was a great soldier. I think he was the second or third highest ranking general in the Continental Army. And so, of course, when he went over to the other side, it was a huge blow. I mean, imagine if our number 3 general in the U.S. Army had suddenly decided to sort of jump ship and join Al-Qaeda or ISIS or something. It'd be a bit of a shock to the system. So it's, he's quite a fascinating, mercurial figure, Arnold. But what we do in the show and what we do in what I do in the book as well is, he didn't start off as a bad person. I mean, he, like any traitor, there's a sort of sliding scale. There's a kind of a spectrum as they move towards that fateful decision to betray their friends and their side and their loyalties and so forth. And that's why Arnold is one of the great figures of American history, I think. He's a very fascinating man.
And it's also a shock to the system in that he was highly successful on the battlefield. I mean, he was at Quebec, he was at Saratoga, Lake George even before that. So his turning coat was, quite a loss for the Americans in that regard. Let's talk about researching spy rings. I mean, studying historic smuggling and spy networks is incredibly difficult for historians. So how did you go about researching Washington spies and the Culper Ring?
Well, you put your finger on it, and that is that books about spies are very difficult to write because spies don't like to have books written about them, and they're not normally in the mood to keep around a lot of incriminating information, the kind of information that later historians find so fascinating in archives. The Culper Ring was almost unique in the intelligence literature in the fact that while they destroyed all of their letters to Washington's staff, he had a very efficient staff, used to keep copies of the Culper letters to him. And then, of course, whenever Washington sent a letter to the Culpers, they would, of course, take a copy of it. And they would, again, eventually, at the end of the war, they were all boxed up and they eventually carted over to the Library of Congress, where the George Washington papers reside. So what we had with the Culper Ring, and this was the real deciding factor for me to write about the Culper Ring rather than anybody else, was that if you put all of the letters together, and it's about 150, 200 or so, they're scattered all around the George Washington papers. Many of them are written under aliases, or some of them are in filigree ink, a lot of them are encrypted. Once you put them in order and you transcribe them, as I did, I spent several months just transcribing all of these letters to and fro, what you have is the biography of George Washington's private spy ring. So that becomes the real spine of the book. After that, you go visit archives and you look at various papers, and there's more than you think. It's just all hidden. You have to excavate it in a way. But I was very lucky with the Culper Ring, and that Washington decided to ignore their pleas to destroy all of their correspondence.
Did the Culper Ring just write to Washington? That seems kind of dangerous.
Well, it was a smaller world then. People could actually go talk to Washington quite personally in many ways. The Culpers never, I don't think, maybe after the war they very briefly met him or something, but during the war they never knew him. They never talked to him personally. They used Benjamin Tallmadge, who was one of their friends, who was a dragoons officer and quite close to Washington in many ways, as their interpreter. But they felt as if they were writing to Washington. I mean, Abraham Woodhull, especially in the early days, Abraham Woodhull was the lead spy on Long Island. He would write these very long perorations to Washington, talking about liberty and freedom and how burning bright the American cause was and how proud he was to be doing all of this. And of course, Washington at one point kind of tells him to shut up and says, "Could you just focus on the facts? And, it's much appreciated, but you need to write a lot less." So these guys actually felt as if they had a relationship to Washington, and Washington had a fatherly interest in them too. He knew who they were most of the time. But for the Culpers, Washington was their he was kind of a confessor. He was like their almoner, he was their summoner, he was their father figure, and he would sort of chide them and chastise them, but also, give them compliments, and they all loved it. It was a very personal relationship conducted impersonally.
Did part of their relationship with Washington involve writing in code? I imagine they would have wanted to protect their identities from the British.
Yes, the Culpers went through several stages of evolution. At the beginning, they wrote in plain text. That is, they just wrote letters, as one would to a friend. As they went on, they would begin developing through Tallmadge's intercession, things like, a code or a cipher and using invisible ink on occasion and so forth. I mean, the funny thing is, at the time, this code, it was a bare transcription code, would today be regarded as childish. I mean, a 6-year-old kid would be able to work this out pretty quickly. But at the time, it was quite advanced. It's basically, you would substitute a certain number for a given word. So all the agents had their own code numbers. And New York City, when they referred to New York City, for instance, they would use a number, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And they would be duly and dutifully decrypted at headquarters. And then later on, they developed a kind of an invisible ink, which was a very advanced mechanism for the time. And even today, we don't quite know exactly what was in it. In the book, I sort of make a stab at using various clues that are left behind about what exactly the ingredients were of this ink. But it's interesting stuff. But again, the Culpers were advanced for their time, but not so much nowadays.
What sorts of men and women participated in the Culper Ring and in this dangerous world of spying during the Revolutionary War?
All sorts, just as they do now. I mean, spying attracts fantasists, well, more than its fair share of fantasists, adventurers, idealists, ideologues, the mercenary, monsters of conceit. Some spies are just plain nuts, others are coldly rational. Well, they're all human, and most of them are a mixture. I mean, Philby, for instance, was an ideological communist, but he was also a kind of a vain egotist who flattered himself thinking about how brilliant he was compared to everybody else. So when it comes to spookery, there are no traits that are mutually exclusive. And that's what makes spying so interesting, I think, is that there's very rarely a good guy and a bad guy. There people are going back and forth as times and circumstances dictate.
Would you tell us about the specific men and women who participated in the Culper Ring? And perhaps you could also tell us how the Culper Ring formed and operated.
Well, to cut a very long story short, the Culper Ring came together in about mid-1778. Benjamin Tallmadge was what we would call the case officer, and he had a childhood friend called Abraham Woodhull, who lived in Setauket, and they recruited a couple more of their old friends, including Caleb Brewster and a couple of others, and later on a chap called Robert Townsend, who lived in Oyster Bay. And so it was a very small group of men. Anna Strong was a neighbor of Abraham Woodhull. I talk about her a bit in the book. She has a bigger role in the show than she did in the actual spying network at the time. She was a kind of a sub-agent, I think, who was used on several operations. But I don't think she was part of the inner ring. And then basically what they would do is they would compile notes and observations and so forth in New York and on Long Island about British deployments, British movements, British strengths, British possible designs. They would wrap them up into a letter, encrypt them, or write it in invisible ink, or whatever they did at the time, and then they would give it, Abraham Woodhull would give it to Caleb Brewster, who was a whale boatman, quite a rough character, and he would sail them across Long Island Sound to Connecticut, where Benjamin Tallmadge or one of his dragoons, or seconded for the duty, would rush them to Washington's headquarters. So it took about a week to get the news from New York up to Washington's headquarters, which, of course, nowadays sounds like an eternity, but at the time was extremely fast and quite efficient.
You spoke about how the Culper Ring centered on Long Island and in New York City. Both areas were occupied by the British Army. What was it like for Americans like the Culper Ring members to live in these occupied areas during the Revolution?
Well, I usually try and avoid the use of the term occupied in these circumstances, though I understand it's a convenient shorthand, which means I use it all the time, and so therefore I break my own rule all the time. Remember, most of the people in Long Island, the majority of people in New York and Long Island at the time didn't regard themselves as being occupied. Not until very late in the war, I guess. They considered themselves British, and as far as they were concerned, the British were sort of defending their own territory against all of these these sort of ghastly patriot types from New England who were the real interlopers. So, sort of the default position was a kind of a neutrality or just getting along with what you were doing. And there just happened to be a lot of military business going on around you. So I think that's what I try and get across in the book, that most people just try and get by. But again, what's interesting is over the course of the war, attitudes harden. Whereas at the beginning of the war, most not everybody, but most people are quite excited to have the British around, and they think they're protecting them against the sort of the patriots from up north. But over time, the British outstay their welcome. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of graft, there's a lot of corruption, there's sort of forms of extortion. You have a heavy army sort of billeting itself on you in a way. And after a while, that begins to grind. And so by the end of the war, people are basically sick of them. So they do want to get rid of them. So Woodhull was odd in that he was, from the beginning, he was much more sort of Whiggish or sort of pro-American, I guess you could say, in his views. But even he waxed and waned as time passed. So for the most part, people just got on. I mean, they were trying to make a living. They were, looking after their families and so on. So a lot of the time, nothing much changed for them. But again, over time, it becomes harder and harder for them to justify the expense of having this red-coated army constantly among them.
Just getting on is part of the argument that some historians use to talk about the War for Independence as a civil war, in that the patriots in areas were just trying to get on as well. Everybody's just trying to survive.
I think that's true. I think it was the first Civil War, I think, is that rather catchy phrase, has it? And I think there's a lot to that. I think after war, most people suddenly became patriots, if you know what I mean. They can sort of change their tune and sort of, exaggerate the degree of their resistance. But the studies of resistance are always very interesting in these circumstances. And I think, again, it depended on which province you were in. It almost depended which town you were in as well, the extent of your political involvement and how pro or anti you were. But I think there's always, with any people, there's a slide in a way that people wax and wane. They go up and down and what they're thinking.
How dangerous were the activities that the Culper Ring were performing?
Very dangerous. I mean, if you were, as poor old Nathan Hale discovered, if you got caught, you got hanged. So there was, it wasn't just sort of all beer and skittles. If they were a slap on the wrist, if they were busted. I mean, if Abraham Woodhull had been caught, if Townsend had been caught, any of them, I mean, they would have. I mean, I guess perhaps they would have been let off, without going to the gallows in certain circumstances. But by and large, they would have been punished very severely. So yes, there was a great degree of danger there.
Was Nathan Hale a member of the Culper Ring?
No, Nathan Hale was one of many spies sent in by Washington in the very early stages of the war. Spying goes through evolutions. At the very beginning of the war, Washington was casting around for officers and some enlisted men to volunteer for in and out missions. Those are the kind of missions that you were sent in. You had to look around the enemy positions, and you got back. You were usually out in the field for a couple of days. And the problem with these kind of in and out missions is that they're almost useless. I mean, hardly any of these ad hoc spies, as it were, brought in anything useful or actionable. Hale was one of them, and he was sent in, and he was an exceptionally brave man. What he's doing was very brave, as indeed all of them were. But he was sent in without any backup. He was sent in without any training. He was sent in without any financing or safe houses or any kind of fallbacks or anything. He was expected to go look around and come back. And he got trapped on Long Island, and eventually tracked and hunted down and brought in by Robert Rogers. And then he was brought in to New York City, and he was sort of rather unceremoniously hanged, as one did with spies at the time. And that was the end of Nathan Hale. The reason we know Hale's name so much is because he had some friends, and it was for sort of propaganda purposes sometime after his death, that a lot of the words, the famous, I only have one life to live, they were all kind of made up and put into his mouth. But Hale was a great man, but he didn't accomplish anything. And what is important about Hale, I think, is that he taught Washington how not to spy. And in the sense that it was after Hale and many of these the failure of many of these other missions, that Washington began casting around to reform a very nascent intelligence service. And that's where Benjamin Tallmadge would later come in, and that in proposing keeping spies, civilian spies, not army officers, stationed permanently behind enemy lines. And then the problem, of course, like Abraham Woodhull, and the problem that came, of course, as it is with any spy network, about the transmission of intelligence back to headquarters. It's all very well getting the intelligence. It's a whole different kettle of fish getting it back to where it's supposed to go. But yeah, so Nathan Hale was important in the sense that he helped Washington decide to change the system from an improvised system to a more regularized system.
In Washington Spies, Alex mentions that Nathan Hale and Benjamin Tallmadge were friends from Yale. What role did Nathan Hale's death play in Tallmadge's role as the handler for the Culper Ring?
Well, yeah, you're quite right. It's very entertaining. Tallmadge and Hale used to get up to all sorts of hijinks back at Yale. It's all quite lovely and very entertaining. It's a difficult question about whether Hale, the example of what happened to Hale, how greatly it influenced Tallmadge himself. Tallmadge was quite silent on the matter. It's likely that, as one does, if your best friend was hanged by the British for being a spy, that would certainly be an influence on you. And I think, later in the war, when Tallmadge is himself a bit of a spy hunter when it comes to John Andre and company, I think he does talk about it, or allegedly talks about it a bit. And, he realizes that Hale was, I think, an unnecessary sacrifice. But I don't know if he's not sort of motivated primarily by some sort of revenge fantasy. He's a professional in that regard.
And how did the Culpers get their name? Was Samuel Culper an actual member of the Ring?
No, Samuel Culper was their alias, or their main alias, the alias used by Abraham Woodhull. It's a sort of a bit of an intellectual parlor game about how or who came up with the name Samuel Culper, which is a very strange name. There's no known surname, I think, of Culper anywhere around. In the book, I take a stab at it and I think it's more of an in-joke in a way. At the time, Tallmadge's boss was a man called Charles Scott, who didn't last very long. And I think he's in the first episode of Turn, actually. In the first season, we have him, and then he's moved out. And I think Culper might be a contraction of where Washington practiced sort of, like land surveying down in Virginia when he was a very young man. Like, I think it's Culpeper. That's where I guess the Culper comes from. As for Samuel Culper, if you reverse the initials, CS, it becomes Charles Scott. And I think that the first name Samuel, I think is, this is going back a bit now, I think it's Tallmadge's cousin or something like that. But those are just guesses, and it could just be a coincidence. It's, SC, flip it around, becomes CS. It could be nothing. So, but basically, I think it's a bit of an in-joke between Tallmadge, Scott, and Washington about coming up with this rather odd name. Later on, they used much more anodyne names, like things like John Bolton and so on, which are much, much harder to trace.
The lack of a paper trail must mean that there are a lot of these parlor games.
The problem with a lot of spy or intelligence literature is that a lot of spies remain these kind of ciphers on the page. There's these sort of names and aliases, and you don't really know anything about the spies themselves. The thing with the Culpers is because we have such a large repository extending over many scores or even hundreds of pages, their characters shine through in their writing. And that's what I found particularly fascinating, in that you can actually put flesh to the skeleton in all of their cases. I mean, even little interesting things like just the type of pens or quills that they use, the kind of expressions that they use, their handwriting, all sorts of things. You can tell a huge amount about a person just from the way they're writing or writing about something. I can give you a couple of examples. I mean, Robert Townsend was a quite well-educated sort of member of the sort of upper bourgeoisie, I guess you'd call it, kind of wealthy, mercantile, and he had a kind of a well-educated mercantile hand. It was very clear. Townsend has beautiful handwriting, and he uses a very expensive, well-cut quill, whereas Woodhull was a farmer on Long Island, and his quill is much rougher. Woodhull's are actually almost the most difficult letters to read, because he's using very like almost a stubby quill, and he uses even for the time, rather dated expressions, things like thou and thee, and certain kinds of abbreviations that Townsend wouldn't have used. And Caleb Brewster, who was always a bit of the action man of the team, I think he was the only one who actually signed his letters with his real name, as if he were daring the British to catch him. And Woodhull himself, again, he reveals himself to Washington, quite a lot. I mean, he sort of says, I am very, very scared right now. and I really want to drop out. And then eventually Washington or Tallmadge will go in there and kind of reassure him and calm him down. So, Woodhull was basically perched on the edge of a nervous breakdown for much of the war, whereas Brewster doesn't indicate any of that, and Townsend himself was much more of a prima donna in many ways. And so that's what makes it interesting. It makes these spies, though they lived more than 200 years ago, it makes them come across as not these dusty ghosts of the past, but as sort of real living people just like us.
Was the Culper Ring successful? Did it provide Washington and the Continental Army with any actionable intelligence?
Yes, on a couple occasions, as I think they alerted Washington when a British fleet was about to trap the French coming aboard their ships. What I try and get into the book is away from this James Bond or Jason Bourne ethos. That is, that intelligence is all about the huge scoop. It's all about the great coup. It's all about the MacGuffin and chasing it around, and the fate of the world rests in one man's hands type of thing. Intelligence in real life just simply doesn't work that way. They helped. They certainly helped, and they helped and they contributed to victory. But I think that's what happens in intelligence. Spies don't win wars, never have, never will.
How did the work of the Culper Ring compare with its British counterpart? Because the Patriots weren't the only ones with networks of spies during the War for Independence.
Oh, yes, no, the British had a very active intelligence activity going on. The main difference is, with the British and the American sides, was that the Americans had Washington and the British didn't. General Clinton, who was in charge of C&C of British forces for much of the war, though he had a very talented and energetic, I guess you could call him spy master in the shape of John Andre, who did a lot of good work reforming and rationalizing intelligence activities. Clinton just simply wasn't as interested in intelligence as Washington was. That was basically it. It was kind of, whatever. And he went on to different things. Whereas Washington is interesting in that he's a natural spy master, and he had he would always cross-reference agents' reports. He always insisted on value for money. He was always very sober and strict with his agents, hence what I said before about him basically chastising Abraham Woodhull and telling him to keep it down a bit and just give him the facts. Washington was very, very skeptical about agents' reports coming in from the field because, as I said, there's a lot of fantasists out there who just make stuff up. So Washington took a real interest in intelligence, and he included it in his calculations. So I think that's the main difference between British and American activities. The British just weren't quite as interested in it as the Americans were, and that's it.
We began our discussion by discussing Benedict Arnold. Would you tell us how he came to be a British spy?
Basically, it all came from Arnold. Arnold was this very, odd and queer fish. He had a colossal ego. He had a great deal of vanity. He was also extremely talented. He's a very good soldier. One thing led to another, and eventually he started flirting with the British, and the British flirted back and batted their eyelashes, and eventually he made the fateful decision to turn his coat and come over. He thought he could get a better deal this way. And I think he may have also genuinely thought that he was doing the right thing. I mean, I'm sure Benedict Arnold didn't go to bed at night going, "God, man, am I evil?" He went to bed thinking, I'm doing this for a reason. I believe that it's time to make peace, and I think that by coming over, I can help broker a peace between these warring nations, while at the same time making a whole boatload of money. So Arnold was a sort of a massive contradictions, and but that's really how it happened. There was no necessity to it. I think he just decided to do it through a mixture of sort of punctured vanity and ego and I guess greed, though he had been ripped off several times, and also just a feeling of making a contribution to the war, and of course he miscalculated disastrously.
We've talked a lot about the actual Culper Ring and how it really worked in history, but we can't let you go until we talk about Turn, because your book, Washington Spies, became the basis for AMC's television drama Turn. Would you tell us how that happened?
It's a very, very, very easy, quick story, and that is one day I got a phone call from a guy called Barry Josephson, who was a producer, and he said, "Hey, I'd like to option your book. Can I send you a check?" So I said yes, and that's basically how it happened. But the backstory to that is that Barry and I may have this wrong, so I'm sure someone can correct me. I think he used to run Columbia or Paramount or Universal back in the 90s and early 2000s, something like that. And he was always wanting to get a Nathan Hale project off the ground. He always wanted to make a movie about Nathan Hale, which is a great idea. But it never happened. Just somehow it wouldn't sell. He couldn't get the financing for it. Directors fell through. He couldn't get anyone interested in it. There was sort of a limited international interest in it. It was all sorts of reasons why it just never happened. And then he went off and he set up his own independent production company. And again, he started thinking about doing Hale as a project. And so he began reading around the subject. And, just as producers do, they get a whole bunch of books from Amazon and they start reading them and seeing what's out there. And, my book happened to be on his desk, Washington Spies, and he began reading it. And then he began thinking that Hale wasn't the main focus here, that it was actually much more interesting to do the Culper Ring. And maybe he could get some interest out of that. So he called in a guy called Craig Silverstein, who was a big showrunner on Nikita and various other shows, and said, hey, here you go. Check this book. Have a look at it. See what you think. And then a couple of days later, Craig called him up and said, yeah, this could be done if we do, spying during the war. But yeah, and Hale's not really part of it. And then that's it. And then they put together a proposal or a pitch, and they went to, I think they took it to Fox first. Fox passed, and then they took it to AMC, and AMC was very interested. Though the interesting thing is that the original pitch was that the show was going to be about George Washington, and the Culpers were going to be these kind of secondary characters in it who popped in occasionally. But AMC said, no. The real focus here are the ordinary men and women. We want to do the Culper Ring. So Barry and Craig went back and rewrote the whole thing and reconceived it, and then it became the story of the Culper Ring, and George Washington is the secondary character. So that's basically how it happened. And then after that, it's just a matter of going through the various obstacles and meetings and all that kind of stuff, and the various stages of development, which just goes on for what seems to be many, many years, and eventually you end up with a show.
That sounds like a good surprise phone call, though.
As phone calls go, that was a very nice surprise. It's one of these things where you get the call, and then I didn't actually think about it much after that. For a long time, because producers option a lot of books, and the chances of actually anything coming to the screen is 1 in 500 or something. So I didn't, I just took the check, cashed it, and went on to other projects. It was just by sheer luck, basically, that it actually made it through the gauntlet and is now on AMC. So I was just very, 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 very lucky, and I won the lottery on that one.
Ed would like to know about the artistic liberties taken in turn. What aspects of the Culper Spy Ring story have been embellished for television?
Oh, a whole bunch of them. It's an interesting question, and I get that a lot, and it's a kind of a two-part question. And the first is that Turn is a drama, and therefore it has to take dramatic licenses to make the story work. So yeah, things have to be changed and embellished and added in order to keep viewers viewing, because otherwise we'd be making a documentary. Though if you think about it, documentaries often change and embellish things when you start examining them. So the way I conceive of it is that the book and the show are twins. They're not identical and they're not Siamese, but they are related. If you're a comics fan, and I think J.L. Bell, who does a lot of stuff on Boston history, I think he's the one who came up with this concept, and it's a good one. And that is that the book and the show inhabit two connected universes. There's what happens in the book does not necessarily happen in the show. What happens in the show doesn't necessarily happen in the book. So they are related, but yes, things have to be changed. That's just the nature of drama. I'll give you an example. In the book, real life, Abraham and his dad basically saw eye to eye politically. They seem to have gotten on pretty well, and they were both kind of Whiggish in their inclinations and so on. That's the truth of the matter. In the show, as you might know, Abraham and Richard, which changed his name even just for various reasons, they are constantly clashing. The father is a deep-dyed blue Tory, very pro-British, and Abraham Woodhull, of course, is a patriot spy. So the father and son clash. But that is a dramatic change, because let's face it, it wouldn't be that interesting if in the show, Abraham and his dad just agreed on everything and said, just nodded along with each other. There's no conflict there. There's no contradiction. There's no clash. And drama works on clashes like that. And so that's why that was changed. And whereas the book is a kind of a very sober, I think, very sober, realistic, clear-eyed, level-headed view of intelligence and how intelligence works in warfare and how you set up and create and establish and maintain and regulate a spy network. The show is like a Wagner opera, and in the sense that all drama is about power and love, or power or love. And that's what the show is. You have to show these clashes of power and depictions of love and so forth. And that's what makes shows interesting. So that's a very long and roundabout explanation for, stuff gets added in, stuff gets embellished, stuff gets embroidered, stuff gets made up, I guess. Sure, but that's just the nature of the sort of medium. The second part of this question is what we do strive for, and that is a spirit of authenticity to the period and those who lived during it. And that is, in the writer's room, we always ask, do our characters make plausible choices within the context of their time? Do we breathe life into a lost and alien world, the world of the 18th century, which has now vanished to us? And I think that's the most important thing to recall. We try and breathe or suffuse drama and life and show a different world to viewers. What it was like living during this very tumultuous time. That's what we try and go for.
Let's move from artistic license to historic license by moving into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Alex, in your opinion, what might have happened if the Culper Ring had not formed? How would its absence have affected the American war effort?
I don't think anything really would have changed much. Washington would still have won the war. He had the better strategy, and he beat the British bit by bit by bit. And in many cases, the British beat themselves. The Culper Ring, like any intelligence organization, does not win wars in and of itself. It helps and it contributes to victory in a myriad of ways, but it does not dictate victory. So I think if the Culper Ring had never existed, Washington would still have won the war, and he still would have gone on and become a great president and so forth. I think we have to be careful with spy literature in that you can't over-romanticize it and you can't sentimentalize it. The Culper Ring were brave men and women. They were ordinary men and women who did extraordinary things in an extraordinary time. But without them, things probably would have pretty much gone on the same.
What are you researching and writing about now?
Well, I've just signed a new contract for a book about the Hindenburg, the airship that exploded back in New Jersey back in the 30s. It hasn't been done in a very, very long time. There's a huge story there about the rise of airships and the competition with the airplane and so on going back 40 or 50 years. Air power is where I came from with my doctor. He used to do a lot of stuff on 1930s British scientific and political history about the early history of radar and fighter defense. And so, I'm getting back to my roots, I think.
That sounds like it's very modern history to me. I think I'm going to stick in the Revolution.
Yes, well, at least I don't have to transcribe everything from 18th century handwriting. I think that's the key point here.
Very true. Very true. Where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how we can get in contact with you if we have any questions?
Well, I have a website. It's www.alexrose.com. You can just email me through there. I also have a Twitter presence of sorts, and I think there's a Facebook page too, which I keep updated with, the reviews that I do and so on. So I think that, I'm pretty easy to get in contact with. So if you have any questions, dear listeners, then please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Alex, thank you so much for shedding light on early American spycraft and the Culper Ring.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on and letting me talk away for such a long time.
I leave our conversation with Alex amazed that George Washington kept so many papers related to the Culper Spy Ring. As we established at the start of the show, I would have made a horrible spy, but still, don't you think that keeping those papers amounts to a major security breach? Now that I mention this, it occurs to me that this conversation is actually very applicable to our present day. Not too long ago, the American people spent time debating the ethics of Hillary Clinton keeping State Department documents on her personal server. George Washington kept top-secret papers among his personal papers, too. Sometimes it's fun to see how history seems to repeat itself, isn't it? I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it answered all of your questions related to the Culper Spy Ring. If it didn't, you can find more information about Alex, his book Washington Spies, plus links to all the places you can contact Alex on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/065. If you listened to this episode and thought, hey, I'd like to join a network, you should join our listener community on Facebook. We don't serve as spies, at least I don't think we do, but we do have a fun time exchanging ideas and talking about history and life. To join, text BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the big orange Join Now button on the homepage. If you listened to this episode and thought, boy, I really enjoyed that, would you tell your friends, family members, and acquaintances about it? The best way to find a podcast is by word-of-mouth recommendations, and I would greatly appreciate it if you would help our fellow history lovers find Ben Franklin's world. And now, it's time for your end-of-episode question. What do you think of Alex's contention that spies don't win wars? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.